Hi and thanks for tuning in. As you probably remember, at the end of our last video, I was talking about the squat and how spending more time in the squat will improve it. The question now is spending time in a specific position like a squat or a split more beneficial than actual mobility training? In today's video, we want to clarify that question and see whether or not one of these methods is superior to the other.
So before we can answer the question whether one method is superior to the other, we have to make sure you understand the difference between mobility and positional training or flexibility. So a squat is obviously not flexibility training, but a position. So the flexibility is also there because pancake stretches or middle split stretches is positional training, but also flexibility training. So mobility are active modalities versus positional training or flexibility training are passive modalities. That's a huge difference. We strengthen our range of motion, so it's actually strength training at our end ranges of motion. Obviously, in mobility training, there are stretching components, but the most important stuff are isometrics, lift off, passive range holds, different kind of stuff with load, for example, as well, where we use our muscles actively in that end range of motion versus positional training such as middle split stretches or pancake stretches are just stretching with no muscle contraction. That's a huge difference as well. So all this, the active modalities plus the strength training leads to more movement variabilities. So outside of that position you want to get better in, you will increase a lot more movements automatically by training with training mobility versus the stretching or the passive modalities has no translation to any other movement, right? You stretch passively, you don't engage any muscles, so you have no movement translation, which is huge, right? And last point, it increases active range of motion and body control, right? We strengthen our end range of motion with actual strength training versus this increases only our passive range of motion and we don't gain active control in this position. Of course, you will get to pancake and middle split with time and effort you put in passively, but that does not mean it translates to other movements or that you increase your active strength in that position.
So we choose the hip joint because it's easier for you to understand, and please be aware this is not what a hip joint looks at all. So the green circle, that's our femur, so bone, and then we have our hip capsule. So we want to have a closer look at what happens to our femur or to our hip capsule or to our hip when we apply those two methods. So we'll start with positional stretching. As we know from before, positional stretching equals passive modalities. So let's imagine this guy or this person has been stretching for the middle split for the last 2 years, and this person has been doing mobility training for the last 2 years. So low body mobility training. Let's leave all the other things aside and only look what happens to the hip when those different methods are applied. So, as I said, this person has been doing middle split stretches, positional stretching for the last 2 years. So what that means is, let's imagine when we go into a middle split, let's imagine this is my leg, we only go into abduction or lateral hip flexion, okay? So it's the only thing that we stretch, and it's stretching, it's passive. So we only use, let's assume we only use this side of our hip capsule or of our hip joint. So we only stretch in this direction in order to increase our range of motion for the middle split. Not only do we only use this part of our workspace, we also this person has only used it passive, so it's only passive range of motion, okay? So no active control whatsoever in this range, but he or she's been stretching in this position. What happens to the rest of the hip? So this is the actual workspace that he or she had before she or he started doing passive stretches for only one position. So what happened is, because this person didn't use this workspace, the workspace here will get smaller. So we do not have access to this. This is gone. No access. So no access to all of this. The only access we have is really close. So that's why when you have great passive range of motion, so passive range of motion in only certain positions, not the entire joint, means, okay, you have great passive range here, but what about the active control in that range of motion? So that's where injuries come into play. When you have great passive range of motion, but no active control over this range of motion, and you have a great discrepancy between active and passive, that's where injuries happen a lot. Like a lot of injuries happen in this, or because of this discrepancy between active and passive. And also because we're not able to, or this person's not able to use, basically this is all gone. And because this person is not able to use the actual joint space or workspace here, this person is really limited, has really limited range of motion aside from this part, which is also only passive. Now that this is clear, we now go to mobility training and what happens to a person or a person's hip joint when the person trains mobility for 2 years. Again, we do not look at all the other things or factors that could come into play. We only look at what happens when you do mobility training for 2 years, or hip mobility training. So we have a perfectly healthy hip joint. Voila! So that's basically what happens, because when we do mobility training, as we've already discussed in another video, which you can watch right here, is when it comes to mobility training, we work on rotational capacities first. Rotational capacities are our priority. So that is internal plus external rotation, okay? Every single joint, we prioritize internal and external rotation except for the spine. We've covered that. So that is why, even though we want to focus on getting better at a certain thing or a certain position, like a split, for example, like when we do a split training as well, but we incorporate our mobility training, we still get the same results from this mobility training. We can use our entire workspace, and not only can we gain control over the workspace that we had at the beginning of the 2 years, but this person also expanded the workspace over the course of the 2 years because of mobility training. So when we do internal, external rotation, we create more workspace, especially internal rotation, throughout the entire capsule, which means, because our femur is a ball and socket joint, we have greater range and greater workspace in this joint, because now when you imagine this person, okay, here, good passive range of motion after 2 years, I guess, maybe even a middle split, who knows. But depending on the structure of the femur or the anatomy of this person, the rest of the joint is not going to work well and it's always going to collide. Maybe this person also feels pain because of this. Versus this person will probably not feel any pain and has great range of motion, active range of motion. And that's really important because you live your life actively. And when you have active control and active strength in your joint, then this will have carryover to your movement, to your training, to your daily life. Which is why this person will probably not feel pain and will probably still be able to get into a middle split, versus this person might feel pain, is able to get into a middle split, let's just assume both of them are able to, but the rest of the capsule has no function, or the rest of the joint has no function at all.
So what's the conclusion of all this? Is mobility training superior to positional training or stretching? It is in a long-term health perspective, of course. It also depends really on your goals and what you want. If you want a sexy looking pig and you want to get the middle split and that's it, then go with positional stretching or just flexibility, that's fine. But if you want healthy joints in a long term with a lot of movement variability and active control over your ranges of motion, then I'll always choose mobility training. Because mobility training has also some components of stretching, you will most likely get the best out of both worlds. You will get increased flexibility if you train mobility. So I would always suggest training mobility over stretching only, but like I said, it depends really on your goals and needs. So with that being said, I hope you liked this informational video, and I hope we clarified the big picture of flexibility training, of yoga versus mobility training, and the difference between both. And if you enjoyed it, please leave a like or subscribe to our channel if you want even more information about joints, about health, about mobility, about our feet. Then just visit our website. We have a lot of blog articles. If you're more into mobility training or want to get more information, I would highly recommend you checking out our online Kinstretch course. We have free classes up there so you can start your mobility journey if you feel like you're lost and don't know where to start your mobility training and how. So with that being said, hope you have a great day and see you in the next film.